If you're a fair dinkum full-blown Aussie, chances are you know exactly what this engine is. And if you're not a fair dinkum full-blown Aussie, well, this bad boy is an Australian institution. It's the Holden Ecotec engine, a 3.8 litre V6 engine used in the Holden Commodore from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. Now, what makes this a classic Aussie engine? Well, it's pretty much down to its complete indestructibility. These bad boys, you just cannot kill them, and Lord knows I have tried. Now, the thing about these things is that if you are an American, it might look a little bit familiar to you because these are kind of based off of the Buick 3.8 or the 3800 or whatever you want to call it, which has its roots right back in the early 1960s. That's right, the Ecotec engine was kind of first conceived in about 1962. Now, we're going to start stripping this bad boy apart to give you guys an indication as to what makes them so good, why they're so indestructible, why people use them for hotting up, making power and doing big fat dirty burnouts in the industrial estate at 1 o'clock in the morning. This particular engine was given to me by a mate who works for TAFE. It was in the scrap bin. I looked at it and I said, hey, you just can't get rid of that. It might be rooted, but I've got a use for it. And from what I can gather, it's probably stuffed, but it's been sitting outside. Luckily, the plenum chamber wasn't sitting straight up, so it's probably not full of water, and of course it doesn't have a sump in it. So it's either rooted because of moisture coming up or moisture coming down. Anyway, that's enough jibber jabbering, let's get cracking. Now, what we've got up the top here is a really big inlet plenum chamber, of course, which then breaks up into 6 inlet port runners. Now, these things are renowned for being an extremely torquey engine. They are great to drive around town because the moment you put your foot down, they really pick up and boogie. And what we've got here is the inlet plenum chamber cover. And what a lot of people like to do to get even more torque out of these things is to put a plenum chamber sort of a lift kit or spacer in here, and that increases this the plenum volume and therefore increases torque. But this is, for I reckon, the reason that these things are such a torquey engine, because they have a big plenum chamber and nice long runners that go straight down into the intake ports. That, alongside the fact that they have just a massive big chunk of cast iron and therefore have a lot of inertial torque, I reckon, as well. There you go. So you've got the plenum chamber off. GM nicely made these bolts captive so they don't come out and accidentally fall down into the inlet manifold. Of course, you've got your fuel rail bolted to the bottom of the plenum chamber. Pretty standard GM type injectors here. And what is interesting is that this is the PCV valve. It's built into the inlet manifold. It's not a plastic unit that goes into a rocker cover or anything like that. The engine breathes through this, which is an integral portion of the inlet, which is actually quite a nifty little design. But the interesting part is now, instead of metric fasteners, we've got these 3/8 fasteners here. And they are, of course, all loose, primarily because this thing was, of course, a TAFE engine. I'm just going to go ahead and use a 10mm socket because they are loose as a goose. Boom. The inlet manifold is off, and you can see one massive portion of this construction of this engine that makes it so special, and that is, of course, the balance shaft. Back when the original Buick V6 came out, it was renowned for being extremely unrefined and shaky. That's because it is a 90-degree V6 based on V8 architecture. And what that meant is that due to a V6's uneven firing sequence, the engine became unbalanced and really shaky. This balance shaft helps to reduce the natural V6 shakiness, and a lot of V6s these days have it. Admittedly, these aren't the most refined engine known to man. If anything, they're actually pretty antiquated and pretty unrefined, but that balance shaft there helps it to feel a lot more sophisticated inside the vehicle. That, in conjunction with hydraulic engine mounts and stuff like that, mean that really they are quite a pleasant engine to use. That also brings us to another weak point of the Ecotec, and that is, of course, the valley cover gaskets. That's what I like to call them. You could also call them just inlet manifold gaskets, and those are these bad boys here. So the thing about these is that they actually have coolant running through the inlet manifold. So if I grab that here, whoop, holy doolies. You can actually see there are ports in the inlet manifold that allow coolant to pass from one side of the engine to the other. It just meant that GM didn't have to put any coolant passages in the cylinder block from one side to the other, probably just to make it a bit cheaper. Now, over time, due to poor quality coolant or just the fact that you know, entropy takes its toll on everything in the universe, this little portion of the inlet manifold gasket actually disintegrates and allows water slash coolant to migrate into the inlet ports and also into the valley, which means that you end up with oil and water mixing together, and it looks like you've blown a head gasket because you end up with a big oily mess. Oil migrates into the cooling system and vice versa, so you get a lot of moisture buildup in the cap, and you will also get oil in your radiator. So of course a lot of people go, holy doolies, I've got oil in my radiator, I must have a blown head gasket. Chances are, and I'd say probably 80% of the time, it is just your valley cover gaskets. Luckily, it is a fairly easy job as long as you've got a metric and imperial socket set, and also you do need some 17, 18 and 15 mil sockets because, well, Australian car manufacturers, yeah, they didn't really like to choose good sized fasteners like the Japs do. What I'm doing now is I'm going to strip all the ancillary bits off of this engine, just get it down to the bare block, and then we can start pulling rocker covers, cylinder heads off and stuff like that. There's your water pump there. Very stereotypical sort of V6 old GM looking style thing. And there's a water pump. Impeller. Big cast iron metal thing. None of this Volkswagen plastic rubbish. But it is sea solid. Obviously it's been sitting for quite a while. Boom. I find it truly incredible that an engine of this construction made it all the way until about 2005, when a lot of other Jap engines had double overhead cam and variable valve timing and all sorts of goodies. 10 years prior, GM was still punching out good old pushrod V6s. And this architecture, I mean, that looks like 350 Chev almost. Not that it's a bad thing, because of course Chevrolet and even, well, pretty much just Chevrolet have been producing pushrod engines and showing the world that you don't need anything else for years and years and years, and they are regarded as being some of the best engines ever. But just looking at this architecture, it almost makes you laugh. Boom. Surprisingly, considering that this engine has been sitting outside, all of this is actually in really good nick. You can see, of course, where water has gotten down in the rocker cover, or at least it has evaporated up into the rocker cover and condensed and run back down. But as you can see, an extremely simple valve operating system. You've got these rockers here which are operated by push rods, which run down from the rocker arm down in, of course, to the cam, which is underneath this sort of valley section here. The thing about these is you can see these little plastic sort of clippy bits here. They are actually the lifter retainers that prevent the lifter from spinning around in the lifter bore, because these have roller hydraulic lifters, which by 1960s and 70s standards is absolutely just rocket ship type material. But for the early 2000s, this sort of stuff was antiquated by, 15 years. That said, it still works beautifully. The actual design of this is quite nice. The rockers themselves are really beefy. They're not just a pressed tin thing like in a 350 Chev. And you can see the very minimalistic design of the valves. They're not canted, they're nothing special. They're just straight down into the cylinder head. Oh yeah, everything's 3/8 in this bad boy. There's the cute little push rod. As you can see, the push rod is hollow all the way through. That's what actually sends the oil to the top end. It is then received into the back of the lifter there. You can see how that sits like that. And then oil will flow out pretty much through the pivot point, through the fulcrum, and through every sort of wearing section. Now, I'm not keeping these in order because, quite frankly, I don't have to. There's the lifter retaining plastics. This is all new to me because, as I said, I have never been this far into an Ecotec. The only reason you generally would be to build one for a speedway. Anyway, you can take the lifters out by the looks of it without removing the cylinder head, and there's one there. Look at that. What a gorgeous little piece of machinery that is. Of course, you've got your roller tip there that rides on the camshaft, and what that means is that essentially the camshaft will never wipe a lobe, which was quite often the case on flat tappet cams. Also hydraulic as well, so oil pressure is fed into this lifter and keeps valve lash to essentially nothing. You can see why it is also imperative that the lifter is not allowed to spin sideways in the bore, because as it is rolling along the camshaft, if it were to turn, then that camshaft is going to be riding on the completely wrong bit of that little wheel, and therefore would cause that to pretty much disintegrate. So we're just zapping the cylinder head off, and man, these are coming apart like butter. Unfortunately, I can't find a 9/16 impact socket, so we're just going to have to fight with this one. Holy heck. That came off easy. Whoa. I reckon this engine has never seen any use whatsoever. Looking at this bore, it's been honed and it's got new pistons in it. which is incredibly bizarre. This head gasket has never been fired on, so what I reckon is the go with this engine is that it was probably rebuilt by a student at the TAFE and then was allowed to sit essentially forever. What's also interesting is that there's two different head gaskets. Well, there you go. We'll get rid of them. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. We've got the lifters out of it. Now it's time to spin her around without having it drop off the engine stand. Now what is interesting is that up the front here we have what appears to be a bearing cap, a bearing shell sticking out of the front. So that's going to be my first port of call, seeing what the heck is going on there. That's a main bearing just sticking right out of the front of this thing. So whoever put this thing together at TAFE wasn't particularly on the ball. Got number one piston out. A few funny things. So obviously this thing has been stripped apart and rebuilt for TAFE purposes. First thing I've noticed is that the oil control ring has been pinched as the piston rings have gone together and the piston has gone into the engine. The pistons are extremely clean, and that led me to believe that they were new. They obviously aren't new. There's a little bit of scoring on the side, but the machining is still pretty much perfect. What leads me to know that they aren't new is this build-up of oil varnish on the pistons, but you can see there they have got an extremely short skirt, especially in comparison to, say, a Falcon piston. That's a Falcon piston right there. This is an Ecotec, and you can see the difference in piston skirt length is massive, really. Now there's advantages and disadvantages to both different types. Of course, having a short skirt, they quite often do that these days to reduce friction against the side of the bore and therefore increases fuel efficiency. This style of piston here is generally used because it produces a quieter engine. You're less likely to get piston slap as the piston is unable to rock so much in the bore itself, in the cylinder. So that might explain why Ecotecs are generally sort of a bit of a clappery, ticky, slappy type engine, and Falcons are a much smoother, quieter engine. As I have said multiple times, these things definitely aren't renowned for their quietness. The main and big end journals are fairly beefy, not as beefy as, say, the Intec or single overhead cam engine. What we'll do is we'll flip this thing back over and inspect the bore. Now the bore is in remarkably good condition. There's no lip on that whatsoever. It has, of course, been honed. Now in this particular cylinder there is signs of the piston having scored the side of the bore purely because whoever put this thing together did a terrible job at putting the rings together, and that's fair enough because it was probably some students from TAFE. But this engine is definitely savable, except for there's a massive crack out of this piston here which I didn't see earlier. So the pistons are essentially junk now that I've seen that one, but there's definitely a lot of good spare parts in this engine. Do I keep it or not? I really don't know. The cam retainer plate is off.
It's interesting that all of the cam bearing journals are the same size. Well, there you have it. The cam is out. As you can see, it's a beautiful little lump stick and very minimal wear on it. No real poor rust or anything like that. That is definitely a serviceable item. I reckon whoever put this engine together obviously didn't do a terrific job. And look, I'm not going to blame anyone because this engine was pretty much put together for educational purposes, but unfortunately, due to a big chunk of this piston being destroyed, it's made what could have been a pretty easy to put back together engine practically almost useless unless I get a new set of pistons for it, or I can find one piston in similar condition.
One thing that I don't explain whilst I'm pulling this thing apart is that the main bearings are not only bolted with these two big bolts shown here, but two smaller bolts, one coming in from each side of the crankcase.
As you can see, the main bearing has a fair amount of wear. That nice frosty aluminium looking stuff is worn down to reveal the material that the backing of the bearing is made out of. And obviously somebody's been in here and smashed it all apart with a screwdriver on disassembly the first time. But there you go. That is the crankshaft for the Ecotec, and you can see essentially why a V6 will pretty much never be as strong as a good inline six, because the split crank journals, and what that essentially means is that
there's only a small portion of meat joining these two journals together in the center, meaning that these crankshafts are inherently weaker than a corresponding inline 6 crankshaft or even a V8 crankshaft where they have Siamese journals. The reason they've had to do this is to create an even firing order in regards to how many degrees between each piston reaching top dead center. So to make an even firing engine, they've split these by 30 degrees, so they are 30 degrees apart from each other. And when you add all the maths together, it means that each piston fires at 120 degrees. If it weren't like this, then you'd end up with a horrible engine with all sorts of nasty vibrations.
What we've got here is one of the cylinder heads for this Ecotec, and as you can see, it's a very GM looking combustion chamber with a really big inlet valve and a smaller exhaust valve. Of course, just 2 valves per cylinder because it's fairly difficult to get any more than that with pushrod construction. Very typical GM looking construction. Square exhaust ports. The valve springs are sort of like a conical style. I think that's for harmonics, to reduce harmonics from what I can gather. Intake ports have kind of got a large rectangular cross section. Of course, you've got these water jackets which run through the inlet manifold and into the cylinder head. They're fairly light for what they are. And as you can see, they're almost hollow in this section here where the push rods run. Overall, just a neat, simple design, not really much to go wrong here at all. Fairly antiquated though. Yeah, what else can I say? Well, there you have it, boys and girls. The famous Holden Ecotec engine. What an absolute ripper of a machine. But now that we've got it pulled apart, we can sort of discuss what makes them such a hardy little engine. Well, when you're looking at it, just from face value, you sort of think, well, nothing really pops out as being extremely overbuilt. The crankshaft looks pretty similar to every other V6 one. Conrods are fairly beefy, I suppose. I think its main inherent reason that it is so durable is the fact that the block is made out of cast iron, and so are the cylinder heads, which means that they have a very similar expansion and contraction rate when they heat and cool. That, in conjunction with the fact that they're a short block, mean that they really don't expand or contract that much anyways. So it means that if you cook one, run one out of coolant, whatever, you're far less likely to damage the engine, blow a head gasket or something like that. Also, the fact that GM never really did a clean sheet redesign with this V6. They just kept running the same basic principles since the early 1960s. They just kept getting better and better with each passing generation. The funny thing is, Kaiser Jeep actually owned the rights to this, well, the Buick V6 for quite a while, and GM bought it back and just kept making them better and better. So you pretty much have 1960s simplicity and underpinnings with modern technology such as roller lifters and roller rockers and better metallurgy, multiple bolt main bearing caps, and of course the big one is EFI, electronic fuel injections. So you also have the benefits of precise fuel metering, less ring wear because they're not getting washed with fuel all the time, less detonation, all the sorts of things that kill an engine are pretty much deleted with EFI, and you're coupling that to essentially really tough, antiquated technology. Now, are they the most refined engine? Definitely not, no. Just rev one past 4,000 RPM and cringe a little bit. But look, they're torquey, they have good power, easy to work on, easy to buy parts for. What else could you want? Also in Australia, these bad boys power the rear wheels of the Commodore instead of the front wheels of whatever the Americans got. So that means that you can sit a Commodore tipping it around a roundabout on Limmy for hours. And generally, unless your heater tap explodes, you won't have any issues. Anyways, that's it for this episode of Full Bore. We'll catch you on the next one when we pull another engine down. What's that engine going to be? Well, that's for you to find out. See you later.